Previously in Dark Places.
When I was just a little kid, and one summer evening, my whole family saw 3 UFOs coming from Kentucky toward West Virginia, and they just hovered just above the treetops. I was probably about 9 years old. I'm thinking this was like maybe 1965 or somewhere in that area.
Most people wake up in the morning, they'll have a cup of coffee, read their morning newspaper, maybe look at some sports highlights and stuff, go off to work. I'll wake up in the morning and look at recent UFO sightings on MUFON's website or the National UFO Reporting Center. Just about every day, I'll see a ton of reports from Pennsylvania. Stan Gordon has been researching and investigating UFOs in Pennsylvania since 1959. Over the years, I've met a lot of people in this field. A lot of them are just in it to make a name for themselves and become rich. They want to push their way to the top, and they don't care who they step on along the way of the ladder. Stan Gordon is one of the good guys. Stan is the author of 3 books: Really Mysterious Pennsylvania, UFOs, Bigfoot, and Other Weird Encounters, Silent Invasion, the Pennsylvania UFO Bigfoot Case, and Astonishing Encounters, Pennsylvania's Unknown Creatures. He's been on countless documentaries and TV shows over the years, and I can't tell you how thrilled I am to have him on our show today.
You were huge in investigating the Kecksburg Incident. I guess that would be considered, the Roswell of the East. That's what I always call it. You want to just kind of touch on that and enlighten a little bit, or anything new on that?
Well, I've started investigating the case back when it happened on December 9th, 1965. I was 16 years old at the time, and it was breaking on the news in the Pittsburgh area. I was listening to actually one of the main radio stations in Pittsburgh, KDK, that had a radio talk show called Contact, and coincidentally, they had a special guest on whose name was Frank Edwards, who you might recognize, who was a well-known journalist who had written some books on strange occurrences, and I wanted to listen to see what he had to say. But almost the entire radio show was devoted to these breaking news reports of this brilliant fireball that was seen from Ontario, Canada, over Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, and whatever it was, it apparently came in over the greater Pittsburgh area about 4:47 p.m., just as getting dark in this area. And it was a very interesting evening. As they're interviewing witnesses, they're reading the wire stories that are breaking, and then later on during the evening, reports are coming in that the object, whatever it was, apparently fell into a wooded area near the little village of Kecksburg in Westmoreland County. So it's about 35, 40 miles from Pittsburgh, depending which way you go. And the military was arriving in the area, the people reporting, and so it was a fascinating night, and I started documenting it that evening, and I started pursuing the case from the time it happened, and years later I've tracked down hundreds of people who were involved in the incident, and it's a fascinating story. We could take hours and hours to talk about the Kecksburg case, but what we now know is that whatever the object was, and there's still a lot of controversy, a lot of speculation, whatever this thing was, it was moving relatively slowly. It made change in direction along its trajectory, especially what was going on within several miles before it fell, because we know it came in from the Pittsburgh area. It moved out towards the city of Greensburg, where I live, but I didn't get to see it. It, according to many witnesses, it moved out towards Route 30 East, but it made a turn to the south. And then it began to track over those little communities out there, people seeing this thing, and it moved out to the mountains of Laurelville. And then we are told that it kind of hesitated, began to track back towards the northwest, towards the Kecksburg area, made kind of a little turn down, and went back down into the woods. And what we did not know at the time was, and I tracked down various people over many years who were all separate. Many of the witnesses, even today, who never went public, didn't know about what other people were reporting. Some of them didn't even realize some of their neighbors were reporting the same thing. And what I found out was that some of the local people, soon after the object fell, they went down into the woods, and they came across this large metallic acorn-shaped object that was dirt and debris around and was semi-buried in the ground. and this thing was about 10 to 12 feet in length, about 8 to 10 feet in diameter. According to one witness who was standing only a few feet away from it, who most of his life was a machinist who worked with metals, he said it looked like somebody took liquid metal and poured it to an acorn-shaped mold. There were no weld marks, no seams, no rivet marks on them, but on the raised-up back part, like you would see on an acorn, he said there were raised-up markings that look more like some type of ancient symbols. And the interesting thing is that the military apparently hauled the object out of there late that night, actually early the next morning, on a military flatbed tractor trailer. Later on, independent witnesses told me that they took the flatbed with the object, which was under a military escort. It went to Lockbourne Air Force Base near Columbus, Ohio. It came there during the early morning hours of December 10th. I was told that they backed it into a hangar. They set up a security perimeter around it. They were given a shoot-to-kill order to anybody approached the hangar without the proper clearance. It didn't stay there that long. It continued on to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And then later I was told exactly what building they took it to, which was not the infamous Hangar 18, was another building on the base. And where it's at today, we don't know. We've heard rumors it's still there. We've heard it's been moved, so we just don't know. It's a long, interesting story because of the different people I talked about, what they saw, the actions that they saw, and the operation that took place that night around Kecksburg. So that's what's really the fascinating part of the story. And you know, it's going on so many years since then, and so many key witnesses have now passed away. Other ones are in very bad health, and we're losing more and more of the people who were involved. But it's a very well documented case, and maybe someday we'll get lucky and we'll find some documents that have never surfaced, or get some good information that will finally solve the mystery once and for all.
Yeah, that would be good. I'm a lot like you, Stan. That Kecksburg kind of set me on a whole course for my whole life too, just like it did with you. I was about 13, 14 years old. I was watching Unsolved Mysteries, and I had seen the Roswell story. I think that's probably everybody's first exposure to UFOs. So I just kind of bought into their excuse that it was a weather balloon or whatever. But then about a year later, I saw the Kecksburg story on Unsolved Mysteries, and that just kind of opened up my eyes. I was like, whoa, there's something to this.
Oh, yeah, well, regardless of what it was, whether it was some very advanced, secretive, man-made space probe, or it was something from who knows from where, it's a very, very interesting account of how the military reacted and how people interacted with the military and what took place. It's a fascinating story.
It's with Roswell, of course, you had the correlation with the crashes. But if you go to like the Phoenix Lights, it's not so much that you have evidence of the crash. It's just so many witnesses saw it. And it's hard to disprove all these witnesses. Now, did they see a UFO from outer space? I don't know, but we know they saw something. And with all of the thousands of reports, you know, it can't all be fake. There's something there that people are seeing.
Oh, yeah. Well, you know, I've been doing this now for 62 years this year. I have never seen a UFO or Bigfoot myself. My hotline's been open since 1969. It never stops ringing with reports. There have been numerous reports coming in over the last several weeks, actually. And I deal with these cases constantly. Year after year, all year round, under all type of weather conditions, reports come in. And you don't hear about them in the news very often because the high percentage of people, even today, especially people who have very good, detailed, low-level, close-range sightings, whether it's a UFO or Bigfoot or other phenomena, most of them want no publicity. So you rarely hear about the really good reports. You hear about the IFOs, the objects that look strange, such as the recent bright fireball meteor over this area, or the vapor trail from the rocket that recently was fired from Cape Kennedy. But those make a lot of news because so many people saw it and reported it. But when a lot of people have really good sightings, you just don't hear that much about them.
Right. Can you get access to the crash site today?
No, and there has never been because it's always been on private property. So you can't go down. There's absolutely nothing to see. When I was down there a number of years ago, I could barely find it anymore. A lot of the trees are down, and no, there's nothing to see at the crash site, and you can't go on the property anyhow.
Right. I was just curious as to, I wonder what state the vegetation and the trees and stuff are today at that site, whether it be, from radiation or, whatever these things use to fly.
Well, we
kind of curious.
Well, many years ago, when we found the original site, and it was actually 1980s when we had our 87, we had our first eyewitness come forward, who actually could take us to the site. Then other witnesses, independently of each other, took me to the same exact location. The radiation levels at that time were all normal, so we've never had any unusual radiation levels years later at the site.
Okay.
I can understand your frustration of not getting to witness that whenever everybody else in town was seeing it, because we had a sighting here in Williamson down in West Virginia back in 2012. I think everybody in town saw it, cylindrical object up in the sky for about 3 hours just hovering over Williamson. And I never even got to see it. My buddy Kyle called at work, told me to go out and look for it, but I couldn't find it. So I missed that one.
Okay, well, there are multitudes of sightings, and yes, you get a lot of high-altitude reports and lights in the sky and zigzagging lights, and of course, a lot of the reports that we get, we can track down. I mean, the last few years, there's been multitudes of reports of the Starlink satellites going across, and, of course, Venus and Jupiter, and you get a reentry of space debris every once in a while, and bright meteors, and other things that look unusual, so a lot of them you track down, but every year, we receive reports you cannot easily dismiss. And I'll tell you, since 2016, from about 2018 through 2019, and surprisingly through 2020, even with the virus situation, we had a lot of reports, really detailed UFO reports, as well as cryptid reports coming in. And while we had some lull in activity in the wintertime, which we generally do anyhow this past winter, now in the last several weeks, some older reports from earlier this year and reports in recent weeks are starting to come in. So things are active again. And I've investigated multitudes of very low-level, close-range, detailed sightings of what appear to be large structured craft or objects. And these are the kind of cases that are very, very difficult to be able to dismiss. And, if you want to talk about some of those, we can do that as well.
Actually, I had one of those. I was probably within, I would say, 500 or 800 feet above me. I could see it distinctly. It was at night in Albuquerque, New Mexico, but it was very close where I could give you distinct details about it. But the crazy thing is it was going across the Interstate 40, and there was moderate traffic out at that night, and I knew there was no way I was the only one seeing this. So I was actually traveling for work. I was on my way home, and when I got home, first thing I did was jump on the computer and start looking if there was any kind of, anybody else reporting this over Albuquerque, New Mexico, and there wasn't anything on there that I could find of that particular incident.
And that happens sometimes. I mean, sometimes I get reports over even very populated areas in past years, and the people calling in said hundreds of people had to seen this thing, and yet you got very few, if any, other reports. But in some cases, yes, we do get multiple reports. And, just to give you an example, I'll give you an example of a couple of the cases I worked on over here. This is just a small example. But back in June of '85, this is way up in the mountains, I believe probably on the border of Westmoreland and Fayette County. And fellow was coming home from work around 12:30 in the morning, and he's about 2 miles west of Indian Head, where there's been a lot of sightings up in that area along the Chestnut Ridge here in western PA. You get Westmoreland, Fayette, Indiana County, and then the ridge goes down to right into Preston County, West Virginia. It's probably one of the most active areas year after year for UFOs, Bigfoot, and other phenomena. But this particular case was interesting. The fellow was coming home from work. He's going around the bend, and all of a sudden he sees a series of 6 lights, and it's very, very low, coming right over top of the trees, and he gets a better look at this thing, and he thought at first it was a Goodyear blimp. But as it's coming down lower and lower, I mean, it's moving very slowly, crosses the road to his right. It appeared to be solid and shaped like an elongated blimp, but it's a solid metallic silver surface. He said it was about 100 feet long, and this thing is hovering right over the field. So the guy actually stops his car and runs. He thought it was a blimp in trouble, and runs out of the car and runs to the field. He's standing underneath this thing. It's so low he could touch it with his hands if he wanted to, but he didn't touch it. And he's realizing this is not a blimp. There's no gondola. It's making no sound from an engine. The only sound it was making was like enormous whooshing, like this from the air moving as it's moving across that area. And he's looking. There's no markings on it. There's no gondola on it. There's no windows in it. It has bright blue lights that are emitted from the bottom of the object. The lights were bright enough he could see the bottom center of the object that was completely hollow. There were 6 blue lights on the top and flashes of high-intensity blue coming from them. There were lights spun in a counterclockwise pattern illuminated the trees and the ground surface. And he realized this was something very, very weird. He ran to a house down the road and knocked on the door to see if they had a camera, but they didn't. And he went back to his vehicle, went down the road several miles to bring back some relatives, and when they got back, it was gone. He called the state police. The state police told him to call me, and what they didn't know was that for hours I was getting reports from across Pennsylvania from different areas, people reporting these very large cigar-shaped objects, in some cases very low to the ground.
That's wild.
And that's just an example. Another one of my favorite cases that happened September 3rd, 1987, only a few miles from where I live, actually, and unfortunately I didn't get to see that one either, but it was right. We had a big mall there at the time. This was Route 30, so it's a busy highway, and anyhow, there were multiple witnesses right around the mall and right around Route 30, and there were law enforcement people actually involved in witnesses as well. And this object is moving across these high-tension power lines and moving right across Route 30 across the road. And once again, multiple people were seeing this thing. They estimate this thing was about 300 feet in length, and no more than about 300 feet off the ground. Witnesses said it looked to be about the length of 2 Goodyear blimps put together, about as thick as one blimp. It was a solid silver or dull gray surface, moving about 50 to 60 miles an hour, but completely silent. And as they watched this thing, we had multiple lights on it. Many brilliant bright lights were white, and they had bright flashing red lights on each end and a bright flashing light at the bottom of it. And this thing's moving horizontal across the sky. It moves across the road to where there's a power substation, and then it turns vertical in the sky, this huge object, and all the power in the area went out for a short time.
Wow. Oh, wow.
And then when the engineers went behind the mall where the annex was, where the theaters were, that the power failure continued there. What I was told was the engineers that examined it, they found that all 3 of the master fuses in the feed line had been blown, which apparently is something that's just unheard of. So it was a very, very interesting case.
I talked to a guy in Prestonsburg, Kentucky a couple years ago. His daughter saw, like he described it as like a big wagon wheel up in the sky with just multiple rainbow colors, like red, blue, everything just circling around. And he said it went from one mountain behind his house over to the other mountain, just crossed the horizon and made no sound or nothing. It's wild. But yeah, there's a lot of reports about them over the power stations like that, though. It's wild stuff.
That's been going on for years. And when I started talking about years and years ago, is a pattern. And it's even stranger than just the UFOs. Many close-range, low-level UFO sightings and many very close-range encounters with Bigfoot and other cryptids very commonly occur in the vicinity of high-energy sources. So you have many sightings around power stations, high-tension power lines, gas wells, radio towers, windmill farms, railroad tracks, goes on and on and on. And a lot of sightings around lakes and rivers and things like that. So there's an energy connection to whatever it is we're dealing with. I have no doubt about it.
Do you find that you mentioned Bigfoot and the cryptids? When UFO sightings go up, those other sightings go up as well, or there's no correlation with them?
Well, yes, and that's what I started writing about in the 70s, and I wrote a whole book about it called Solid Invasion, the Pennsylvania UFO Bigfoot Casebook. And I first noticed this back in 1972. when we had an outbreak of a series of strange events on what they call Humphrey Road outside of Greensburg, where people lived for years along this fairly large wooded area, but nothing unusual happened. Then all of a sudden, different people from residents around it began to call me independently, reporting screams and howls and something heavy bipedal walking in the woods. People reported seeing a broad-shouldered creature chasing dogs. They began to find footprints. They began to see UFOs, and they began to see these very small little spherical lights very close to their home and in the trees. Well, that's when I began to notice that there was something interesting going on. But it was 1973 when we had the biggest UFO wave ever documented. It started January 1st of 73 and continued to the last day of the year. There were hundreds and hundreds of UFO sightings going on in Pennsylvania. And back in 1973, as you recall, there were no cell phones and there was no internet. But the local newspapers and even some of the national and even the statewide papers were picking up a lot of these UFO reports that were coming in some of our investigations. See, in 1969, I set up my hotline for the public to report UFO sightings. But in 1970, I founded the first of 3 volunteer research groups to investigate these reports, and they continued for many, many years. But in 1970, the first group, the Westmoreland County UFOs group, was started in this area, and by 1973, we expanded to cover the state of Pennsylvania. And the group was kind of unique in that the majority of people involved were specialists. We had scientists, engineers, technicians, police officers, former military intelligence people, educators, pilots, all kind of specialists who volunteer their time to investigate these reports. And I had it set up that we would respond to cases 24 hours a day. And luckily, the group was already set up because we have this massive wave that starts in 1973 with all these UFO sightings. And then in the summer of 73, we had the largest Bigfoot outbreak ever documented that went on for months until 1974. And we've had, as far as I can recall, we've had Bigfoot sightings documented every year since 1974 here in Pennsylvania in this area. And that's when we began to have these very strange cases that were documented where we had both Bigfoot and UFOs seen together at the same time and place. And I was not out looking for this type of thing whatsoever. I mean, I got involved investigating Bigfoot in the late 60s. And I had always thought from what I knew about Bigfoot that whatever these things are, they're apparently some type of unknown animal. And then all these strange reports start coming in from widespread areas. A lot of them were coming in initially to the police departments. And these people didn't know each other, and most of them were very concerned, very afraid, and very hesitant to even talk about what they're experiencing. But some very weird things began to show up as we began to investigate those reports. One of the things was my team would get out to some of these locations where there had been a Bigfoot sighting within a short time, and there would be trails of large footprints with big strides between them under different ground conditions, and in the wintertime in the snow. But sometimes these tracks would suddenly stop and vanish and disappear, which made absolutely no sense. There's no way on the conditions we found them it could have been fabricated. And that, by the way, is still going on even in the last couple of years. But anyhow, that was strange. And then some witnesses were telling us they'd be standing there watching a Bigfoot at a certain location, and it would instantaneously physically disappear and reappear somewhere else where they could see it. And then we began to have those weird reports coming in. We began to see a pattern. We'd have a UFO sighting, and then within minutes, hours, days later, we'd have a Bigfoot sighting in the same area. And then we had the case with Bigfoot and UFOs seen together. And that's when things got very, very strange.
Oh, wow.
I saw one of those reports just a couple months ago about the snow. I want to say it was in Georgia, but I can't remember for sure where that one was at. But the guy was filming out in his yard, just a perfect snowy field, had some footprints going off the road, and then they just vanished into more snow out in the middle of the field.
That's exactly. And if you go to my website, stangordon.info, you'll find some of these amazing stories on there, and there's a still from a video on there from this area from January of 2018 when a family contacted me from North Huntington, where, again, a lot of sightings around there for years, and they had a big, heavy snow, and next morning they woke up to see these 16-inch footprints going away, the whole way across their backyard. I believe it was like 4 to 5 foot stride between the tracks, and you see all these huge footprints clearly intact, and they get to the playground where the kids played, and suddenly the tracks stop and disappear, and there's no more tracks. And these cases are getting much stranger. I began to catalog a lot of this stuff. I began to contact other researchers around the country, around the world. Back in the 70s, I started publishing my information back then, and a lot of people were skeptical. But I can tell you now, in the last few years, more and more people in the Bigfoot field are now beginning to see. They're getting the same reports. They're getting these they're seeing these different aspects with the Bigfoot phenomena, which suggests more than more that these things are much stranger than just an unknown animal. I have a whole listing of things that I've uncovered for years. I have a whole lecture I do on this topic called Strange Aspects of Elusive Bigfoot. And the evidence is more and more, for lack of a better term, as reluctant as I say it, that we might be dealing with something that's interdimensional. There's a physical and a non-physical component to this phenomena. It's much more involved than just Bigfoot, because some of the other cryptid cases have some similarities to them that I've uncovered, and it's a very, very strange phenomena.
I tend to lean more that way, too.
Well, yeah, that would explain a lot of the elusiveness. Out of thousands and thousands, probably into the hundreds of thousands of sightings that's been reported, there's very little footage up until, the past few years. Of course, now everybody has basically a camera or some type of recording device with them all the time now. I think that's why we're seeing more video and more pictures of these. But that would definitely, explain why, they're so elusive.
Well, I don't know if you recall this case or not. The whole story is my Silent Invasion book goes into great detail about some of these very weird cases. But it was one particular case among others that were somewhat similar that really convinced me that we're dealing with something that is not a normal flesh and blood animal. It's going to take a few minutes, but I'll be glad to tell you the story.
Sure. Yeah, that sounds good.
So this goes back to that wave of 73 and the 74. February 6, 1974. And this is up in Fayette County, Pennsylvania. Now, again, as we talked about Fayette County, there's just a lot of activity up around that general area. And anyhow, there have been a lot of reports, but there was a lot of reports coming in during that time period of that particular day. And I was getting UFO reports from widespread areas. So during a 24-hour period, there was quite a lot of activity going on. But this particular site on February 6th, and some of the people out there will remember, there was around the country, there was a big national trucker strike. There was some violence going on. There was gas rationing in the country. So I couldn't get gas to get up there that night till early the next morning. But because there was violence on the highways in Pennsylvania around the country, here in PA, the National Guard and the state police were patrolling together. So you had members of both teams going and respond to this particular case. And what we found out was that this woman who lived deep up in the mountains, lived in a little cabin home. She lived there all her life. She knew animals very well. She was pretty much not afraid of much of anything. She was a good shot. She was sitting there watching TV that evening when she hears this noise on her little front porch. She had some empty soda cans, some pop cans out there, and someone was knocking the pop cans around. And she had recalled that a few weeks before there was some wild dogs that come through. She figured, I'll bet you those dogs are back. So she thought, you know what, I'm going to grab my shotgun. I'll grab my double-barrel shotgun, and I'll load one chamber, and I'll shoot it over their head. So she does that. She grabs her shotgun, she loads the chamber, and she walks over and hits the switch to turn on the front porch light. She turns on the light and steps out, but there's no dogs. But I believe about 6 feet in front of her is this 7 foot tall, hair-covered creature, Bigfoot. And as soon as the light went on, it put its arm straight up over its head. And what's her reaction? She pulls the trigger and shoots right into it. She said there's this bright flash of light, like a strobe on a camera, and that huge, hairy creature physically disappears right in front of her. But that wasn't the end of the story either. Her in-laws lived about 100 feet away, and they heard the shot, and they called her on the phone, asked what she's shooting at. She explained to them what happened, her son-in-law grabbed his sidearm, starts walking down that dark road towards the cabin, and he said he's surrounded by 4 or 5 hairy people with eyes like coals of fire, started shooting at them, ran to the cabin, and about the same time there's this large luminous object, they said like a big Christmas ornament, hovering over the woods. That's when they called the state police. And they had a number of animals out there, including several big dogs. And I talked to the primary investigator, and he said, I don't know what happened up there, but there's something very, very strange was going on. He said by the time we found the place, everything was pretty much back to normal. But he said, based on the animal reactions, he said something very weird was going on. He said, plus the witnesses were very, very shook up, very, very upset. And he said, I had no doubt they believed they were telling the truth. But when they got there, there was not a sound. The dogs wouldn't make a sound. And there were several big dogs. I think one was an Eskimo Spitz, and was in a cage, and he put his hand in to try to pull the dog out because the dog wouldn't even move. I mean, that dog should have ripped his arm off, and it didn't even make a sound. Now, when we got there early the next morning, all the dogs were barking. Everything's back to normal. But I was told that the horses and other animals were not eating properly. They were scared. The cats in the house were frightened. So something very odd happened up there. That was the case, among others, that convinced me there's something more to this than just a flesh and blood animal.
There was no blood or anything left behind from the...
No. We did find the BB pattern from the porch out in the middle of the woods. We found a BB pattern in the tree where she shot at this thing.
How scary is that? I mean, to know that something that size is basically allowing you to live, and there's nothing you can do about it.
Well, I've interviewed hundreds of people who have seen Bigfoot out there, and I don't recommend people shooting at him, but over the years, here in Pennsylvania, especially during that time in the 70s, numerous people with different types of weapons shot at Bigfoot, and nobody ever brought one down. I mean, brought one down to the extent that in some cases they just fell down, then they got back up and walked off into the woods, but unharmed. But then you've got these other very weird cases. And it's not just in Pennsylvania. I'm hearing of these reports now for years from all over the country and around the world, but you heard so little about it. But now in the last few years, there have been several other books now written about it. More and more cases are coming to light. I mean, you go on the internet and search now, you're going to find a lot more about this particular aspect of the phenomena. And it's much stranger than people realize. I said years and years ago, the phenomena is so strange it protects itself.
Yeah, that's scary stuff. I've been seeing a lot of reports about the Orbs of Light. Do you get a lot of those, the orbs around a Bigfoot?
Yes, exactly. And again, that's why I started writing about in the 70s. And it's going on more and more now. And what I was focusing on years ago, most people want to talk about UFOs, they don't even know about it or don't talk about it. I call them mini UFOs. I started investigating them back in the 60s. And these sightings continue year after year. We've had amazing incidents with them even in the last few years. And I call them mini UFOs because they're generally small. They're generally spherical, anywhere from 1 to 2 inches to 1 to 2 feet in diameter. Generally spherical, but not always. They're sometimes metallic and solid. Other times they're transparent. Sometimes they're just bright light sources of different colors. What's so interesting about them, they're not high in the sky. They're low to the ground. They approach people very closely. I've had cases where people they could easily put their hands out and touch one. I've had them enter people's homes and cars through open windows and go out right through the body or right through the walls of a house, for example. There was a case years ago, I remember many years ago, up from where you see Groundhog Day up around Punxsutawney, and a woman told me she was in her kitchen one morning when the small sphere came into the kitchen, was floating around. Her reaction was she took a broom and started striking it, and as I recall, what she told me was it broke into 2 identical little spheres. They floated around the kitchen and went back out the window. But in more and more reports over the years, and more reports in the last few years in Pennsylvania around the country, from Bigfoot researchers who are in areas where there's a history of Bigfoot sightings. And they're not seeing Bigfoot, but they're seeing these strange spheres of light, or these sometimes swarms of, sometimes multitudes of small but oversized like fireflies, or other type of light phenomena. And this is going on more and more all across the country and other areas as well.
There was a guy used to be in my UFO group. He passed away back in 2013, but he was living down in Florida, and he had one go through his house like that. They were in the living room, and they had like the storm door open. It was a hot summer night, and this ball of light just came through the glass on the storm door and went through their kitchen and just went back out through the other side and around the laundry room.
Yeah, and this is exactly what's going on. And that's what I'm saying. The whole phenomenon, it's so amazingly interesting. It is so strange, and yet there's, you don't hear about some aspects of this. Hardly anybody talks about it. Very few people talk about it. You are getting more people now in the UFO and the Bigfoot field that are beginning to look more into it. They're not laughing as much as they used to, and it's just an amazing thing. And here was an interesting case again from Fayette County. One of my associate researchers, Jim Brown, investigated it. This is in November of 2019. And a lot of these sightings, by the way, with Bigfoot and UFOs and even these mini UFOs are in daylight. You see these TV shows, and they come off giving the opinion, you can only see a Bigfoot at night. It's not the way it is. There are many, many incidents in daylight as well. And but anyhow, this one case was in the afternoon. This fellow was riding home on a back road up in Fayette County, and as he's going over this hill, he sees his ball on the road just sitting there blocking his path. So he stops his car and he scratches his head like, "What is this thing? It's so unusual. It's just sitting there," and he decides he's got to go move this thing. He gets out of his car, and as he starts to walk towards it, it begins to fade away and suddenly just vanishes in a few seconds and disappears.
Wow.
So there's a lot of mysteries going on out there, and I've like I said, I'm dealing with these things year after year. I mean, very often people are calling in, and the people calling in, I mean, some of these guys are outdoorsmen, they're hunters, educators. I mean, all kind of people have been reporting things, and they have no reason to make up the stories. A lot of them are hesitant to even tell anybody about it. They want no publicity, but their stories and the details are so similar.
I used to travel through Pennsylvania quite a bit, and I don't think people that's not been through there or not from there don't understand. You get like around Somerset or Breezewood or places like that, it's almost like the Pacific Northwest as far as the wilderness goes. And to me, that's just a perfect habitat for a hotbed of sightings of Bigfoot. It has to be around, Shanksville and like I said, Somerset and on over, really, I mean, a good chunk of Pennsylvania. You get up around, say, Wilkes-Barre and up that area. I mean, it is very rural communities, mountainous, wooded areas that would be a very good habitat for an unknown creature like that.
Exactly, and there is a lot of forested areas and wooded areas in Pennsylvania where there have been many, many sightings for years. There have been sightings all across the state, but this part, the western part of the state, the southwest area, is very, very active. And I told you about the Chestnut Ridge, especially on the Westmoreland, Fayette County side, continues to be very active year after year. I just interviewed a guy a few weeks ago that had a daylight sighting in this past January of a Bigfoot he said was 7.5 to 8 foot tall. He'd been hunting for years, and he was just stunned by what he saw. And unfortunately, where he lived, there's no cell phone signal. We had no phone to take a picture of it. And but we are getting other pictures of footprints in the snow in those areas. We're getting reports of screams and howls. And we've had Bigfoot sightings for years all through that area from different people. And, what I found is this. You can have a sporadic incident where, for example, Bigfoot can walk out in front of your vehicle almost anywhere. But there are certain areas, certain geographical locations where, for whatever reason, this phenomena seems to focus on. Everybody's heard about the Skinwalker Ranch in Utah.
Sure.
But what was happening here in the 70s, and since that time at different locations, is a little different. Because sometimes there's certain particular areas, not just on the ridge, which is a long area, it's a widespread area, but there's certain areas that it's more specific, and the phenomena seems to concentrate on those. And It's not just in Pennsylvania again, but there are incidents now all over the country and out of the country where the same thing is going on. And whatever this phenomena is, and I'll give an example. For example, on one of the locations for several years now, there's been paranormal phenomena, apparitions and hauntings, and UFOs and footprints and screams and Bigfoot and UFOs and balls of light, and goes on, and various people not living there who don't live there, others that come there and have experienced it themselves. I've got involved in another area up in northern PA where it's been going on also, and apparently even the last few weeks and months there's been activity up there. But there's other parts in the country where this is going on. And that's what's so interesting. Why is it that this phenomena, for whatever reason, seems to focus on certain areas?
Yeah, you did the invasion of Chestnut Ridge with Seth Breedlove at Small Town Monsters there a couple years ago, and I'd encourage all of our listeners to check that out. That's an amazing documentary.
It is, and Seth did a very good job on that, but of course, you're limited to time. You can't get into it. And some of your listeners, they can check some of your local libraries. The Silent Invasion book I wrote goes into great detail. I mean, there's amazing stuff in there. So some of your local libraries might have it as well. And if you want to really learn something about some of this phenomena, it's so strange and so detailed. And I know we generally don't have time to get into all these kind of reports.
Well, Junebug's got an interesting story about a UFO that down his way actually hit was it a CSX train? Oh,
yeah. Did you hear about that one, Stan? The one that supposedly collided with a train back in 2002?
I heard something about it. I've heard that story. I think it's the same one, but I'd be glad to hear about it again.
We investigated that one. Kyle Lovren from our group, he wrote a book, a couple books about casebook studies like yours. And me and him and Chad McKenzie went out. We investigated it, and it was years after the fact. We couldn't find anything. We couldn't find any witnesses or anything. But there was supposedly a train coming around the bend. It was on its way to Paintsville, Kentucky, and it just came upon three. I think there was 3 lights on the track near the La Vista River, and they were coming around the bend, and they just thought it was another train coming, so they kind of dimmed their lights to not blind the other train. And then suddenly they just lost all electronics in their engine, in their locomotive there, and they couldn't stop it. They kind of glided to a stop like a train. They can't use the brakes and stuff like a car, but they kind of slowed to a stop, and they collided with one of these lights, and it supposedly did a lot of damage on the locomotive and 3 of the coal cars behind it. But they cleaned that up. We can't find anything to either prove or disprove that one, but it's a cool story.
Well, yes, that's a very interesting story, and there's I can't recall any in Pennsylvania like that. But we've had some very interesting cases with electromagnetic effects and things along that line with different cases. So some of these cases are just amazing. And another thing with Bigfoot, as I said, there's a lot of very strange elements to the phenomenon that very few people know about or talk about. But one of them is the EM effects even with Bigfoot cases. And this, again, is not just in Pennsylvania. It's very rare, but it's been reported around the country over the years, too. So we've had cases, for example, where large solid objects hovered over top of vehicles, and the headlights would go out or the motor would stop and the object would move away and the power would come back on. But we've had incidents where a Bigfoot would walk out near a car and the engine would start to sputter. They would lose power, and when the creature went away, the power came back on. So that's been reported as well.
I have never heard of that before. Wow, that's amazing. I really never heard of and put the two together. I've never heard any stories like that before.
Well, again, there is so much. There are so many little details like that most people don't know about. That's what makes this thing so fantastic and so interesting. And I've done different shows over the years, or I've met other researchers, and while we're comparing notes, we're all coming up with such similarities that we've uncovered very similar details. And that's what makes it so intriguing, because so many people from such distances are giving you the same little details, which is very important.
I'm with you. I don't want to see one be killed, but the older I get, the more I think that may be the only way to prove one, as bad as I hate to say that. I don't know any other way.
And it may well be that something that we can't do anyhow by the way we understand. And again, like I said, I don't recommend anybody shooting at these things, but over the years people have, and nobody's ever been able to bring one down that we can confirm.
No. And as many, well, with Ohio and West Virginia, Pennsylvania, I mean, there's hunters, by the droves in the woods that, see these things, and you either don't hear about the story or you don't know that if they've shot at it, even if they did or couldn't find it, you don't know.
Yeah, and I have talked to hunters in recent years who have seen them, come across them, and some of these guys, different witnesses I've interviewed over the years, and a lot of these are professional adults, and their lives are dramatically changed, because most of these people had no belief whatsoever Bigfoot could exist. They never would have believed it until they saw it. And some of these guys have been out in the woods for 20, 30 years, and they told me, I'll never go back in the woods again. They were their lives were completely changed by what they saw and what they experienced.
Well, as a hunter, I do hunt, and I have, I'm almost 50 years old now, and I've been in the woods probably since I was 9 or 10 years old, and I've never had an experience with anything like that. But I could see definitely where that would possibly change my view about being out in the woods. Even though I would be armed, it still would probably, if it wouldn't make me stop, it would always be in the back of my head.
Yeah, there's so many people, they just never go hunting again or anything once they see these things.
And other than Bigfoot, I investigate. I have all kind of cryptid reports coming in here year after year. I've written 3 books about them now. I'm working on a 4th book, and it's going to have some incredibly bizarre cryptid things that most people never heard of before, and some is pretty chilling actually. But anyhow, it's not just the Bigfoot. We get the Thunderbird reports, these huge flying creatures that continue to be reported year after year. We get the out-of-place Black Panthers, which are very strange. And I found a connection between the Black Panthers and the Bigfoot phenomena and the similarities. And it's just so unusual, so bizarre what's coming up and what we're finding. And again, luckily, it's not just my research, but others are now finding the same thing for years, but are just talking about it more and more recent years now.
Well, used to this entire topic was, I get hush. People didn't talk about it a lot. But now that more sightings are happening, more pictures are being taken, more things are being recorded, the media's got more coverage on it, good or bad, either way. They're covering it. And people, I feel, are starting to come out of a shell somewhat and start reporting. Before, if you said you saw a 9-foot hairy ape-like bipedal creature, the first thing somebody's going to say, well, you're crazy. What were you drinking? But now you don't have that so much. Now you got people that have also seen it. And once you have one start talking about it, it almost domino effects. Well, some guy down the road seen it, or a guy 20 miles down the road seen it. And it starts opening up discussion, which is what has to happen.
Exactly. And, what's interesting is with both UFO and Bigfoot case and others, over the years, you'll get a particular case, and then maybe months, maybe even years later, you'll get somebody else who was able to confirm that incident. But they saw the same thing the same day, and they had certain details that could confirm that that's when it happened.
Well, it's like in our area here, and Junebug's more schooled on this than I am, we're in the Mothman area. And, the sightings that were saw in that particular time, I think there's been a few later in the years, but, the entire town was talking about that, which then eventually the news picked up. And then, of course, the Silver Bridge fell on top of that, during that time, and it kind of sparked it on top of that. But yeah, once, you get the discussion going, it's like a snowball. It just starts rolling and getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And in my last book that I did, Actually, I remembered very clearly when the Mothman reports were breaking in the news around this area and across the country in the newspapers. And around that same time, I was hearing rumors that there had been something similar seen around the Pittsburgh area, but you could never track it down. It was years later that I found somebody who was directly involved in the incident. And so it was in the summer of '66. And so we may have had a Bigfoot incident up here that actually happened before it happened in West Virginia. And now I'm still looking into it, but we have information now on another incident in the Pittsburgh area around the same time period. So there may have been something going on up here as well.
Well, that thing travels.
Well, we're getting these reports of these winged humanoids too. Probably one of the most interesting one and most popular up in this area was a case I investigated back in 2011 up in Butler County, north of Pittsburgh, where once again that county, for years and years has been reports of everything. All kind of cryptids and UFOs and weird things. But I got to know this witness very well. He's a professional person. Got to know him and his family very well. And anyhow, this fellow was early morning hours of March of 2011. He was riding down this country road between the towns of Chicor and East Brady. He's riding down the road, and his headlights hit an area of grass to the right side of the road, and he thought it was a deer, and he slows down a little, puts his beams up, and this thing rises from the ground. It walks in front of a big sign, and this thing is about 8.5 feet tall. And when I interviewed the guy said, I know people tell me they've seen Bigfoot around this area. He said, this thing was not a Bigfoot. He said, this thing was at least 8 foot tall, but it's covered with smooth, leather-like skin that was either dark tan or light brown in color. And the head was kind of shaped like an aerodynamic helmet, and the face was flat. The eyes were kind of swept back. And the ears, he only saw from the left side, and they came back and were pointed backwards like a flap. The arms were very muscular, and there were claws on the hands. And he said what really stood out were the legs. The legs were extremely muscular, but they did not move or look like human legs. They moved like they were bent backwards. And he said what appeared to be wings on its back were tucked into its body, with the wingtips extending towards the side of the head. Well, what's interesting, within days, the local group up there, the BORU, the Butler Organization of Research the Unexplained, they interviewed several other people who described seeing the same thing.
Wow.
Here's one report from up in that area. There were two witnesses. They were near a ice cream stand. They were about 30 feet away from the creature. They said it was at least 9 feet tall, had dark brown skin, long arms, and broad shoulders, had a pointed head, flat forehead, pointed ears, and what appeared to be wings on its back. Body was extremely muscular. There were 4 finger-like claws. Eyes were squinted, scrubbed upwards in a corner. The mouth was like a slit. The wings looked like see-through mesh and resembled wings on a bat. The claws were black as coal, and the witness said this thing was straight from hell.
Wow. That's scary in itself, just the description.
It would scare me to death.
Yeah. And that's the kind of things that go on. I deal with strange things like this constantly, all kind of reports, and it's going on. And the strangest of the reports in the last several years is getting stranger and stranger, let me tell you.
Yes, Stan, we could talk to you for hours and hours, but we're not going to keep you that long, I don't believe. We're going to have to let you go here. But we sure appreciate you. You're awesome. I've always had a lot of respect for you. Tell our listeners where they can find your books.
Okay, well, they can check my website out, too, for sightings and information on it, and hopefully maybe some events, maybe later this year if the virus situation improves. A lot of people want to get back out there again. But anyhow, my website is stangordon.info, I-N-F-O. They can actually email me at PAUFO@Comcast.net. It's on my website also. Email and phone contact information is also on the website. My books are available at Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com. I have 3 books out now. Silent Invasion, the Pennsylvania UFO Bigfoot Casebook is very popular. really mysterious Pennsylvania, where people were physically very close to UFOs, Bigfoot and cryptids, and astonishing encounters. The latest one has all kind of very strange UFO and mainly cryptid reports in it. So I think you'll find them very fascinating.
I've got your first 3 books, and I can't wait for that 4th one to come out.
Well, we're hopefully in the next few months. I was expecting to have it out by now, but things have gotten backtracked with the virus, a lot of things going on around here. So hopefully in the next few months.
Hopefully. That'd be amazing. Everybody's cooped up and ready to get out. I think everybody's got cabin fever.
I'm one of them, I can tell you that.
Me too. So StanGordon.info. Stan, it's been a pleasure. I can't even begin to tell you how much I've been looking forward to this. And hopefully we can keep in touch. Any new info coming out or any new reports of anything, we'd like to stay in touch with you.
That sounds great, and I hope one of these days we can see each other again down at Mothman.
Yeah, that'd
Absolutely.
be awesome. God bless you, Stan. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks a lot. And send me a link once you have it up. I'll put it on my website.
Okay, I sure will.
Thank you.
Awesome,
All right,
thanks.
take care of yourself. Good night.
Yes, sir.
Dude, that was freaking awesome.
Stan Gordon. I met Stan up at the Mothman Festival back in 2012, and I bought, I think, his first book at the time, and one of his DVDs, and we talked for 30 minutes there at his table, and then I went back the next year. I stayed in touch with him through email, keeping him updated with any kind of UFO sightings, anything done this way, and then like the next year there, I was just walking around out in a sea of people trying to figure out where I wanted to go and everything. And I heard this voice just coming from the back of the crowd, "Hey, Junebug, over here." And I turned around looking at Stan standing there, and he's just an awesome guy.
That is cool.
So
I'm
we
actually
stood around and talked some more.
really going to try to go this year.
Yeah, there's nothing like the Mothman Festival. I went to Crypticon back in 2019 in Lexington, and that was awesome. And there used to be an event in Charleston, ShakaCon. They would have some celebrities and stuff like that there.
I thought that was a singer.
There's nothing compares to that Mothman Festival, though. That is cool. The atmosphere of it and the people is, I don't know, it's hard to explain. There's just something magical about it. Thanks again, Stan Gordon, for being on the show. Next week, we're going to have Terry Lovelace here. And if you've had an experience you'd like to be on the show, or if you'd like to have us read your story for you on the air, you can email us at indarkplacespod@hotmail.com. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.